I'm sure you have one or more social media accounts, be it Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, GitHub, or many other such service providers where you are registered for an account. Now, these service providers in turn are willing to provide authentication services on your behalf. So, for example, you see the proliferation of a number of websites and mobile applications where you are allowed to log in using your social media accounts. Now, how does this actually work? Many of these social media account providers act as authentication service providers using a protocol called as OAuth. We'll look at OAuth and how it enables these third-party authentication providers to provide authentication on your behalf and allow you to log into other services using their social media accounts. I'm sure you might have heard in the passing about OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 and might have heard from people saying that Facebook provides OAuth 2 based authentication or Google provides OAuth 2 based authentication and so on. And I'm sure you must be wondering what exactly are these OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 meant to be. Now, OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 are authorization frameworks that are based on open standards. And these can be used over the internet to authenticate your identity to many websites or mobile applications. Now, when you use these services, you are depending on one of the social media accounts like Facebook, Google, Twitter, Microsoft, Instagram, GitHub, DigitalOcean, and many more, who provide these authentication services for others to make use of. These authentication service providers promise to the users of this authentication service that they will authenticate the identity of the user based upon the submission of the credentials for these social media services. Now, there is a complementary service called OpenID, but of course not related to OAuth, but provides similar kind of service. But most standard social media service providers, as you see listed here, provide OAuth 2 based services these days. Now, as I mentioned, OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 are authentication protocols, and OAuth 1 was the first protocol that came into being. This was evolved from Twitter, Blaine Cook being the person behind it, and this is documented in the Internet Engineering Task Force RFC 5849. So if you want to read the gory details of how these protocols work, that is the place to find them. OAuth 2 protocol evolved from OAuth 1 to make it more simpler and to provide a simpler way for client development. And this is documented in IATF RFC 6749. And thereafter, another bearer token usage came about in IATF RFC 6750. Now, from our perspective, we don't really want to go into details of how these protocols actually work. Instead, all we are interested in that is how do we leverage these for user authentication within our web application or within our mobile application when we need to authenticate the user to the Express server that we have been building on so far. Now, we'll primarily concentrate on OAuth 2 because in the exercise, we will look at the use of Facebook as an OAuth 2 authentication service provider. And here, we need to understand a few terms to see how exactly this OAuth 2 protocol works, at least the bare bones details of how the protocol itself functions. Now, in case of OAuth 2, we always talk about a resource owner. Now, in this case, the resource that I'm referring to is not the resource that is stored on the Express server. Instead, the resource that we are referring to here is the identity of the user. Now, any server like the Express server that we have been building wants to get access to this resource, that is your identity. Now, where is your identity? Your identity is stored on one of those social media authentication service providers like Facebook and so on, because you have already created an account on these social media sites. So your information or your identity information is, or your profile information is stored at Facebook, for example. Now, your Express server wants to get access to your identity and verify that it is really you that is trying to access the Express server. So in this case, the Express server that we have developed acts as the client application. So this is where the client application is the application, which is the website or the mobile app that wants access to the resource server in order to obtain the information about you. What is the resource server that we are talking about? This is the Facebook OAuth authentication server, which also provides your profile information on request. Now, of course, you won't randomly keep distributing your profile information. Instead, you want to be able to verify that you are providing access to your profile information to an authenticated service provider or an authenticated server. Now, this is where your client application or the Express server here, for example, will register on Facebook with an account saying that I am operating an app and I want to register myself as a potential source which can approach you to authenticate users when they provide access to their profile that is stored on your site. So the Express server in this case, acting as the client application, will register itself on Facebook and obtain a client ID and a client secret from Facebook. Now, when the Express server registers on Facebook, you need to have an account on Facebook, an authenticated account on Facebook, which you will use to set up this app on Facebook. So once you register yourself, then you will get access to a client ID and a client secret. Now, the resource server, as I mentioned, is the server that is hosting the protected data. Protected data meaning the profile of the user that wants to access the Express server. Now, so the Express server wants to access this resource server and get hold of the profile data of the user that wants to access the Express server. So you see the relationship here. So when I talk about a client application, what I don't mean the front-end application, but the Express server that is trying to provide you access to resources that it has on its side. But the Express server, in order to enable you to access, will need access to your Facebook resource server, which will authenticate you and provide your profile information to the Express server. So the resource server that I'm talking about here is the Facebook's OAuth 2 authentication server plus the resource server that gives you access to the profile information of the user. And the authorization server is the server that will authorize somebody to access the resource server in order to retrieve the profile information. Now, the user is the one that has the profile information on the resource server. The user should authorize the Express server to go to this resource server to fetch the profile information. But if the user needs to authorize the Express server, the user needs to log into the Facebook account and then obtain an information from Facebook called as an access token, which the user then will pass on to Express server. Now, when the access token is obtained from Facebook through the OAuth 2 protocol, the access token will be issued in terms of allowing this client application or the Express server, which is already registered on Facebook, saying that this client server I will authorize to access the profile information from the Facebook OAuth service provider. So again, this is a bit confusing. We'll see a diagram where this flow of information is explained a bit more clearly to you. The one point that I just mentioned is about an OAuth token or the access token. What is this access token? The access token is something that the authorization server issues for you. Which authorization server? This is the third-party OAuth 2 authorization server, Facebook server in this example. So the Express server application, now you as the front-end user wants to access something from the Express server application. The Express server application will tell you that you authenticate yourself from Facebook and then obtain access token from Facebook. This access token is issued to the front-end user from Facebook when the user logs into their Facebook account. Now, this access token is issued in the name of the client application, the Express server, which is already registered on Facebook. So, in order for the user to access Facebook to obtain this access token, the user requires the client ID of the client application or the Express application. So this client ID is embedded in the front-end application that this Express server will serve up for you. So if the Express server is serving up a website that you are accessing, then that website will contain code where the client ID of that Express server is already embedded in there. One more piece of information that I mentioned is the client secret. Now, in the authentication flow that I'm going to talk about, the client secret will be never revealed to anybody. The client secret will be only on the Express server side. But when the Express server tries to authenticate and obtain access to the user's profile from Facebook, the client application, the Express server, will send both the client ID and the client secret together with the access token that the user supplies to it to Facebook. And Facebook in turn authorizes the client application to access the resource server in order to obtain the user's profile data. And once the user's profile data is obtained from the Facebook resource server, then my Express server is going to create an account for this particular user who has logged in with their Facebook account, and then subsequently supply a JSON Web Token to the user, which the user can then use in order to access the resources that are stored on the Express server. So again, to summarize this, I have a diagram here to explain this to you in a bit more detail. In addition to this, there is also a refresh token. When an access token is issued by the Facebook OAuth 2 server, the access token has a limited lifetime. After that, the access token will become invalid. Now, so the access token has to be kept confidential. So all this exchange of tokens between the different sites will be done in an encrypted manner using HTTPS protocol. So make sure that when you're sending your access token from your user front-end application to the Express server, you will only send the access token through HTTPS, not HTTP. This is very important because you don't want your access token to be revealed to anybody, because anybody who can get hold of your access token can pretend to be the client application and then get access to your user profile. So that is very important. Now, since the access token has a limited lifetime, there is also a corresponding refresh token which can be used to refresh an expired access token. Now, in the kind of flow that we are going to be using with our application in the exercise, we will not be able to use the refresh token. Anytime the user wants to authorize the Express server to go and fetch the profile information from Facebook, the user will have to explicitly supply a new access token that is obtained from Facebook. The one part that I have just mentioned but briefly, but I haven't elaborated, is how does the client application, the Express server in this case, how does it register itself at the OAuth 2 service provider? Now, this is where many of the OAuth 2 service providers provide a way of registering an app on their site. So a client application, the Express server in our example, will register itself as a client application on the OAuth service provider. So as you will see in the exercise, the very first step that we will do is to log into Facebook with our account and then create an app on Facebook's site. When you do that, Facebook will issue you a client app ID and a client secret. This procedure applies to many other OAuth service providers because this is the general flow that the OAuth 2 protocol talks about. So the client app ID and the client secret are useful for us to be able to prove our identity to the OAuth server when we are passing an access token that we obtain from the user. Now, there is also a redirect URL that you need to register when you are registering the client application, and you will see me performing that in the step when I register the app on the Facebook site. Now, to summarize the information flow that we have just briefly talked about in the earlier case, let me start at this point. The first point to look at is the resource owner. So the resource owner here is the user that is going to use his or her social media account, Facebook in this example, as the authentication for the user. So the resource owner is the one that has the profile about the resource. And this profile information for every Facebook account will be stored on the Facebook server. And so the Facebook server provides the resource server here. So that is the OAuth service provider that you see on the right-hand side of this picture here. So imagine the Facebook server on the right-hand side. The client application, which is the REST API server, the Express server that we have implemented, is the client application in this case, and the resource owner is the user, your front-end user that is going to authorize you to go to Facebook to verify that user's credential. So when you want to access information on the client side, you will first have to go and authorize this client application to be able to obtain access to your profile information. So the client application, if it is acting as a web app, it will provide an appropriate button in there saying login using Facebook. And so when you click on that button, essentially the first step is initiated. The user authorization request is initiated. So your client application through the user agent. The user agent is basically the client application, the front-end application. It could be the Angular app that we have developed, or the mobile app, whether it is Ionic or whether it is a native script app that we have developed in the courses earlier in this specialization, or even a native app like an iOS app or an Android app. All these act as the user agents. So the user agent, the user authorization request passes through the user agent to the authorization server, which is the Facebook server. Now, when that is passed in, then the resource owner or the user who is trying to give access to his or her profile to this client application will have to authorize Facebook to be able to share this information with the client application. In the implicit flow grant approach that we are using in our example here, and also in the exercise that follows, the implicit flow grant approach is the most suitable approach when you're implementing a web app using a framework like Angular, or a hybrid mobile app with Ionic or native script, or even a native app. The implicit flow grant approach is much more simpler way of operating the OAuth 2 for such kind of applications. So when the resource owner clicks on the login button, then the authorization server will prompt the resource owner with the information saying, this client application wants to access your profile information. Do you authorize it? And so this will be popped up by Facebook, and then you will click on a button there saying, yes, I authorize this client application to access on my behalf. So at that point, the authorization server on Facebook, the OAuth 2 authorization server on Facebook, will generate an access token. To generate this access token, it will make use of the client ID for this client application, the Express server application that we register. So the client ID should be part of the user agent that this user uses. So this client ID will be embedded into the Angular app, the Ionic or the native script app, or even an iOS or an Android app. So the client ID will then be used by the user agent to tell the authorization server saying, this client application wants access to my profile, and I am willing to authorize you to allow the access to the profile. So at that point, the authorization server will send an access token to the user agent in this case. So remember, this access token comes into the user agent, which is the mobile app or the Angular app that is implemented by us. Then this user agent will take this access token and then pass this access token over to the client application. So the OAuth to login with the access token will be passed on to the client application, the Express server in this case, at a particular route on the user's router, the authentication route on the client application side. Now, previously we saw the use of local authentication where we sent a request to /users/login. Now, for this to work in our app, we will set up another one on /users/Facebook/token and so on. So another URL on which we provide this access token over to the Express server. Now, when this access token is obtained by the Express server, the Express server will take this access token and then together with its client ID and the client secret, it'll send this information over to the authorization server. And the authorization server will then allow the client application to access the resource server in order to obtain the profile information. And so the profile information will be sent back in step number 6 back to the client application in this case. So when the client application obtains the profile information for the user, then the client application will create a new account for the user on its side if an account doesn't exist. If that user has already logged in earlier using their Facebook ID, an account will already exist, so the client application, the REST API server, will simply cross-check to see that this user account already exists, and at that point the user is authenticated through the third-party login functionality provided by the OAuth to authentication service of Facebook. At that point, then the client application will generate a JSON Web Token in the example that we will implement in the exercise, and then pass this JSON Web Token back to the user agent or the front-end application or the Angular app or the Ionic app or the native script app. Then the JSON Web Token will be subsequently used by the user in order to authenticate himself whenever he or she wants to access any resources stored on the Express server. So once you obtain the JSON Web Token, all subsequent operations, you have already seen how to do that with the JSON Web Token. So once you obtain the JSON Web Token, your job is done, and then you can proceed forward with the normal operation from that point onwards. Now, when the JSON Web Token expires, then you have to go through the whole process of re-authenticating yourself and subsequently allow the users to access information on your site. So with this quick understanding of how OAuth 2 operations work, again, as you see, there is a lot of details here, but fortunately we don't have to deal with all these details because we're going to be using a node module that takes care of much of these details on our behalf. Since we have already set up our Express server to use Passport, we can now use another node module called as Passport Facebook Token module. The Passport Facebook Token module essentially implements the implicit grant approach that I talked about earlier, and then you can initialize a new strategy, a new Passport strategy within your application. And so the Passport Facebook Token module enables you to set up a new Passport authentication strategy to use Facebook-based OAuth 2 API. And so to make use of this module, you install this by saying npm install Passport Facebook Token -- save. And then once you install that, then you will configure a Facebook strategy within your application, and thereafter make use of this to configure the strategy for your passport to make use of if we are making use of the OAuth 2 based authentication for our application. With this quick understanding of OAuth 2, let's move on to the exercise where we will configure our Express server to indeed make use of this implicit grant approach to enable us to verify our identity to the Express server and thereafter gain access to the resources, the dishes, the promotions, and the leaders' information that is stored on our Express server.